We remember the 6th generation of consoles most vividly. Games no longer resembled primitive piles of polygons, yet still had a certain charm of unrealistic virtual worlds to them. And we would continue to enjoy them unto eternity if one day announcements and then news hadn't started to appear. Every headline would shout out at you, "Behold, next gen." And the first game console to enter the new stage of console wars was the legendary Xbox 360. It will be the first milestone in our story about the HD era. But first things first, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. You're on Dragmatic. Let's roll. Thanks to the original Xbox, which didn't reach for the stars but was quite solid, Microsoft was able to get a foothold on the markets firm enough for the company to start talking about a new console. It was a decisive step by making which the company was telling that the previous success wasn't a mere coincidence. So the developers decided to do some serious gap analysis regarding their first project. Thus, the name for the upcoming console was born. Instead of the obvious Xbox 2 or the funny Nextbox, Microsoft claimed that the new console differed from its predecessor so much that its entire design made a 360 turn. It's worth noting that with such approach, Microsoft were very lucky to nail it with the new Xbox, because 360 degrees is, a circle, like, it doesn't get you anywhere. Never mind. Instead, it's better to pay attention to the changes made by the developers. The differences were striking at the very first glance. Instead of a bulky box, which was the original Xbox, 360 had a sleek white design, while its joystick was no longer resembling a miniature spaceship and became one of the best and most handy ones on the market. Now, on one hand, in terms of the hardware, the console also received a significant upgrade. There was a funny story during the development, by the way. My fellow content makers have already told it in all the details, so I'll just say a few words. Microsoft couldn't find a decent partner to work on the processor, and after all the rejections, they turned to IBM, who were already engaged in similar work for PS3, together with the engineers from Sony. At the time, IBM already had the patent for their technology, but were pissed with Sony's attempts to take it away. Because of that, IBM had nothing against sharing the patent with both sides, which was a jackpot for Microsoft. Not only did the company legally get the work of their direct competitors, but also took, as it turned out, a very wise decision not to use the sophisticated architecture of the PS3 and make everything easier and, as a result, more accessible to game developers. On the other hand, the 360 had some hardware flaws that weren't critical, but still a pain in the neck. The most notorious issue was the one called Red Ring of Death. Here's the thing, the first revisions of the Xbox 360 would constantly overheat due to cooling problems. Overheating could easily knock the console out of service, which was indicated by 3 red lights. All of this could happen outrageously suddenly. You come home from school, uni or work, turn on your freshly bought white gaming box only to see it winking at you with red lights as if saying, "No games today, pal." In addition, there was no HDMI port on the basic model of the console, though the commercials clearly said full HD. The hard drive also appeared only on the later versions, but in comparison to overheating, those were minor inconveniences that were ignored in order to enter the market as quickly as possible. And the result was worth it. Xbox 360 beat the PS3 by a full year by hitting the shelves in late 2005. Microsoft even tried to make up for the disappointing Japanese market launch by cooperating with the father of the Final Fantasy series, Hironobu Sakaguchi. But alas, in the end, nothing really worked out. Anyway, let's rewind what awesome games were there.
Jack, rip that door.
I'll begin with a title as important to the console and its genre as Halo was for the original Xbox. I'm talking about the famous 3D shooter Gears of War, which blew our minds with its dynamic and brutal action. It offered us everything we could expect from such a game: crazy gunfights, cool and tough characters, improved graphics, and most importantly, co-op. Single player was also an option, of course, but not only did co-op bring more fun, the local AI was designed to deal with really fierce offensives from several players. So unless you had a death wish, the game's tactical elements were also designed for more than one player. However, even alone, there was plenty of fun stuff to do. You had to jump from one cover to another, shoot back, and annihilate the enemies in close combat. Even the trivial reloading process had some sort of a minigame. If you managed to press the reloading button an extra time, the process would accelerate and the protagonist would get a damage bonus. Should you fail to do that, the weapon would jam. And thanks to the epic plot about the war between humanity and the Locust Horde, a race of reptile-like creatures, the shooter kept you on edge of your seat until you beat it in one sitting. As a result, Gears of War won numerous awards, was later released on PC, and of course spawned a whole series of sequels that became iconic for the entire genre. Speaking of Halo, that series was making progress as well. We got a whole bunch of games with every part being more interesting than the previous. Halo 3 was the precipice of everything that happened in the entire series. It had an extremely intense and emotional campaign and an impeccable multiplayer. Halo Wars showed us that a great shooter can be turned into an equally great strategy game. One could reasonably ask, why? But it was a success, and that is all that matters. Halo Reach was sort of Bungie's farewell to the series, and the tragic atmosphere of its plot, which told the backstory of the original game, emphasized it perfectly. It would seem that the series should have ended there, but then Part 4 came out, accomplishing the seemingly impossible task of continuing the story without dropping the bar of quality. Naturally, the approach of the new developers affected the way you felt Halo. For example, the multiplayer now used its own maps instead of levels from the story mode. This changed, compiled with the others, caused a lot of talk about Halo turning into Call of Duty. Though in the end, it turned out that the new line of development didn't spoil the enjoyment of the game one bit.
Wake up, Chief.
Another highly anticipated sequel was Fable 2. In its core, it remained the same engrossing fairy tale as the original, but the sequel was larger in almost every aspect. For example, the in-game world was as enchantingly magical as in the first game, only it became several times larger and had better graphics. The story was once again built around a revenge-seeking hero whom we controlled since his childhood, only the storytelling was way more grand and epic. However, all the seriousness was smothered by the first cutscene, where we see a sparrow flying over various realms with insanely epic music playing in the background. The bird then reaches a rooftop of some high building only to cinematically shit on the protagonist. Welcome to the amazing fairy tale by Peter Molyneux. One of the interesting innovations was the protagonist's follower in the form of a very cute dog. The furry friend not only pleased all the pet lovers, but was also extremely useful in fighting against enemies and searching for valuable loot. The main feature of Fable was still there as well. The protagonist would take part in numerous events and make numerous choices, all of which affected the in-game world, his reputation, and the attitude of those around him. Long story short, Fable 2 was made as a classic sequel, striving to take the best from the original and multiply it.
It doesn't matter who you are or what you're driving, okay? Bring your ride and bring your friends and just get down here now, okay? It's day one of the greatest festival on earth and we are gonna have some fun this year, yes!
An opposite tactic was chosen by the developers of Forza when they made a spin-off to the series called Horizon. If previously the series was focused solely on recreating the experience of sports racing competitions on real track and under real rules, now we were presented with the open world street racing. According to the story, the protagonist arrived at the Horizon Festival to take part in the races. Obviously, he wanted to become the best, but the current leader didn't see him as a worthy opponent. Thus, our hero begins his long and arduous journey to success by winning races. Sounds a bit Need for Speedish, but only at the first glance. Forza retained its attention to details that create the experience of participating in a large-scale competition. For example, the player would earn special bracelets of different colors that showed his status in comparison to other drivers. To obtain them, you had to win in the festival races, which required a car of a certain level. Apart from all that, there were illegal races that ignored the rules of the festival, showcase events where you could be put up against, say, a hot air balloon, and many other elements that created this peculiar world of street racing. Of course, multiplayer was there as well. It would be weird if they didn't allow us to explore this gorgeous day and night change supporting world with other players, who, by the way, had divided into two camps. Once liked the new approach to the series, while the others were saying that Forza is about a different kind of stuff and it doesn't need all these simplifications. However, given that Horizon is now released along with the original Motorsports, I'm sure that in the end everybody was satisfied. Our team highly recommends playing this series, especially the fourth part, which is also available on PC.
How's your car running?
Papers.
By the way, since I've already mentioned Need for Speed, why not saying a couple of words about Most Wanted, the part considered by everyone to be the best in the franchise. All the more since its Xbox 360 version looked way better than ports for other platforms. If by any chance you're not familiar with this racing classic, then firstly, how in the world did you manage to miss it? And secondly, in a nutshell, here's what the game was all about. In the ever-autumnal city of Rockport, there was a blacklist of the 15 most wanted racers. Our characters would come to town and begin to move up this annual career ladder when suddenly his, I dare say it, world-famous BMW M3 GTR was sabotaged and taken away by the antagonist named Razor. So we had to start our path all the way from the very bottom. After that, the game offered you mad adrenaline races, dynamic police chases, sick tuning, although a bit less sick than before, and most important for me personally, the best soundtrack in the whole series.
Fresh out the house, got the beat. As I ride up and down Martin Luther.
The previous parts also had good music, but the feeling of passing a sharp turn in a painted Mustang at breakneck speed while Disturbed or Prodigy are blasting in the background, that, let me tell you, was awesome. I think I know what I'm going to play today after this video. In the meantime, let's get back to the Xbox 360. One of the console advantages, at least marketing-wise, was the Kinect camera, which became available in 2010. It was used as an auxiliary device, allowing you to control characters, menus, and pretty much everything else using your body. Thanks to the two cameras and the infrared sensor, Kinect was able to measure the depth of the image, which on one hand expanded the camera's functionality, but on the other hand increased its price to an unpleasant $150. But these are all details. In a nutshell, we had a small black box in front of which we had to repeat the actions shown on screen. For example, your Shape Fitness Evolved allowed you to work out using this technology, while Kinectimals allowed you to spend more time cuddling with virtual pets. In theory, all of that sounded awesome, yet a little weird for other people in your household, but in practice, there were certain nuances. The first red flag came from Peter Molyneux himself. His studio made a lot of fuss with its Kinect project, which, judging by the demo, allowed quite realistic and diverse interactions with virtual person. It seemed to be some sort of unfathomable fiction, and it remained as such because the project quickly fell off the map. Later, it turned out that the technology actually worked, albeit with some problems regarding motion and voice recognition. In 2010, it took nothing to excuse such a device for having a minor flaw like this, if it didn't make certain titles almost unplayable. For example, the hoverboard racing game Sonic Free Riders looked quite decent, but the characters were barely controllable. Despite that, the player only had to bend and jump. The biggest problem, however, was that with this format, even the best games were unable to keep the player engaged for long. Kinect adventures that came with a camera offered some fun quests, with each one being only a few minutes long. Though, of course, there were some pleasant exceptions like the Just Dance game series, which got the Kinect support on the Xbox. Each part of the series was about dancing to all kinds of popular songs. The game was able to read its players' movements pretty well, while the songs ranged from easy and upbeat to truly challenging. Perhaps the only downside to Just Dance was the fact that anyone could try it simply by playing a song and dancing to it. Still, having such a fun party game was more of an exception, and in general Kinect turned out to be a failure, albeit being rather innovative.
LeVar, you gonna let those bitches disrespect us?
Shit, what you think?
The console had more success with traditional titles than with risky ventures. Take Saints Row for example, another exclusive third-person shooter. It seemed that once again we had a game about gang wars and street life set in a fictional yet realistic American city. In a word, another GTA clone.
Oh shit, here we go again.
But upon closer inspection, the game turned out to be not a clone, but rather a decent competitor. For example, relating yourself to the protagonist was much easier, as you had to create him yourself. The story was still linear, but with a grain of variability. You could choose which missions will lead the protagonist to a necessary point in the plot. The game also had a reputation system reminiscent of Fable, so you couldn't just beat everyone you meet into a pulp without having to face the consequences. The main thing I remember about Saints Row is that playing this game was pure pleasure because shooting, driving, and map controls were convenient as hell. I can't say that the game one-upped GTA, but what I can say is that the Xbox had a great alternative to it. Another thing worth playing on our today's console was Ninja Gaiden 2. Yes, the modern version of good old Ninja Gaiden that made us die countless times back on Dandy. The series had been rebooted back on the original Xbox, while the second part, which was released on the 360, was not only hardcore and demanding, but also fun and player-friendly, like any decent sequel. The essence of the game hasn't changed since the 8-bit era, only now it wasn't a platformer, but a slasher with a good combat system, which was complemented by fairly smart enemies and tons of gore. All of that put Ninja Gaiden 2 almost on the same level with Devil May Cry in terms of style. Now add a variety of weapons, abilities, and cool bosses, and you got yourself an awesome game. One may ask why it's better to play the Xbox version of this game instead of, say, its redux for PS3. Because the original was much more fun and interesting, that's why. For example, in the PS3 version, the number of enemies was reduced to improve the frame rate, and to compensate that, the remaining enemies got inflated health bars. All the gore was censored, which is why the field of battle often got covered with purple smoke. The balance also changed drastically, which affected both the game's difficulty and economy. All in all, it's still playable, but why bother when there's a better version without unnecessary changes?
They told me, son, you're special. You were born to do great things. You know what? They were right.
Of course, the 7th generation of consoles had multi-platform games that remained loyal to themselves. As a part of today's video, I'd like to mention Bioshock, especially since it was released for Xbox 360 a year earlier than for Sony's console. As one of the developers said in an interview, the version for the PS3 wasn't even planned in the first place. So what we have here is another shooter, first person this time. Here's the synopsis. The protagonist, with quite an original name, Jack, ends up in an underwater city of Rapture as a result of a plane crash. The city was designed as a utopia to create an ideal society, but naturally, things went sideways. Firstly, the city's creator turned out to be a sketchy individual with questionable motivation, and secondly, the superpower-given substance called Adam was discovered. All of this turned the city into ruins full of dangers and puzzles, which we had to explore. It is worth mentioning that Bioshock was perfectly constructed as a shooter. Among other advantages, I'd mentioned a decent leveling system, combat variability, and beautiful design locations. The game's main advantage, however, was the deep story that touched on the topics of moral dilemmas, the oppressants and the oppressed, dystopias, and much more. I'm sure you can still find numerous long reads written by the players about what thoughts did the game provoke in their minds. From this point of view, Bioshock was not just a good game, but a true work of philosophy that showed us what was next-gen back then. To wrap it up, the Xbox 360 was a great console both in terms of the device itself and the games it offered. By the way, I almost forgot to mention that the console supported backward compatibility with many titles from the original Xbox, so Microsoft made a console that wasn't exactly a correction of mistakes, but rather a quintessence of experience accumulated over 2 generations. This allowed not only to catch up with Sony, the longtime market leader, but to successfully compete with it and even be ahead of it in some ways. However, the moment was spoiled by another Japanese company, which will be the topic of our next video. For now, I invite you to the comment section. Feel free to share what games have you played on the Xbox 360. I'm genuinely curious. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time.